They're starting over. There had been a large population for a long time on the earth, but they had become wicked. And therefore God started over. Noah and his family were the only ones who were spared. And after a few generations, there was a large enough group that now they were beginning again to repopulate the earth. God had told Noah, "Be fruitful, multiply, spread throughout the earth," just as he had told Adam and Eve. But as we begin the record of Genesis 11, the descendants of Noah, they're traveling together, as is natural. There's not a whole lot of them at this time, but there's a larger group than before. They're traveling together and they reach a fertile plain. It's now known as the Fertile Crescent. It is what we might call Mesopotamia. And they stop there. They say, this is a good place to settle down for a while. And they begin to try and, how shall we say, experiment with some different technologies. Now, when we think about technology, we think about iPhones and computers and stuff like that. For them, where they were with their technology, not that they were any less intelligent, but just from the standpoint of time to develop things, they began to recognize how to build bricks efficiently. You see, there are different ways of building bricks. If you've ever looked into it, it's actually a fascinating process. And they began to learn how to build more durable bricks that they could actually build more stable structures with. And so they have these bricks, they have mortar that they've developed, they have the capacity now to build more impressive structures. And so they have an idea. They say, "Come, let us build a tower and a city around that tower. The tower can reach up to the heavens and we can build the city." And they say, "Let us, in doing so, make a name for ourselves as mankind." They don't say the mankind part, but that seems to be the implication. "Let's make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered all over the face of the earth." Basically, the idea is we're stronger together than apart, it seems. So they begin to undertake this building project, to build a great city, to build a great tower. And as they undertake this project, God, we're told, sees what they're doing. And using kind of human language, of course, God doesn't physically have a body to travel from place to place, but the language that's used, God says, "Let's go down there. Let's see what they're doing down in this city, building this tower." And he sees what they're doing. And he says, this is what they're doing now. They haven't grown into a huge people yet. They haven't done a whole lot of things yet. There's a lot that still is unwritten in their history, and yet they're already doing this. What else will they be able to do? If they put their minds to it at this stage of the game, if you will, nothing will be impossible for them. And that does not seem to be a pleasant prospect for God. So he says, well, here's what we'll do. It's interesting, by the way, he consistently uses the plural, us, we, in this, seeming to reference his different persons. He says, here's what we'll do. We'll confuse their language. That way, only certain small groups among this group of Noah's descendants will be able to understand one another, and they will be forced to separate. So he does. You might imagine, again, using human language, not literal language, the snap of his fingers, suddenly there are who knows how many different languages distributed among this group of people. They can't understand each other. So they give up their project, and they begin to disperse further and further across the face of the earth. This is an interesting story, as always, true story. This is an interesting story recorded for us in Genesis 11. We probably heard it growing up in Sunday school many times. Might have even seen depictions of what the tower might have looked like. This is an AI-generated interpretation, but I think it's fairly accurate. Usually it would have been kind of a stepped type structure like this, whether it was square or round, we're not sure. But we're probably familiar with this general story. Yeah, this is how languages came to be, different languages came to be. This is a demonstration of, man's arrogance or something like that, all those kind of things. I want us to try and dig a little deeper this morning and ask some questions of the text. I hope that it'll help us to maybe get a deeper sense of what's going on. Because the first question we really need to ask here is, why was there a problem? I mean, after all, think about our own society. We have towers, don't we? Is that a problem? Does God not like towers? Right? Or was it a problem that they were only staying in one place? Or was the problem the attitude? Or was the problem the location? Maybe God doesn't like that area. After all, of course, we're probably familiar. They would name the place Babel because it sounds like the Hebrew word for confusion. And eventually this would become Babylon. This would become the place that ultimately would take Israel into captivity many, many, many centuries later. What's the problem here? What exactly is it that God doesn't like? I mean, his wording is not particularly descriptive. He just says, or rather they just say, come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower with its top in the heavens. Let's make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. There's not a whole lot in here that's super descriptive that stands out of, oh, this is bad, right? It's not like they say, oh, we're going to, build a tower with its top in the heavens and dethrone God and we'll be the new God or something like that. It's not like they say, we'll make a name for ourselves so that we don't need God anymore. It's not like they say, we'll be dispersed over the face of the earth, unlike what God wanted us to do. Which means we have to read between the lines a little bit. I'm not saying that the answer isn't in what they say. I'm saying that it doesn't necessarily stand out. One option, as we've already alluded to, it could be that part of what displeases God is the fact that they're not actually spreading over the face of the earth. After all, just as he told Adam and Eve, God told Noah, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. The idea being, I want the earth to be repopulated after the flood. Well, they're staying in one place. They don't want to be spread over the earth, so certainly that could be part of it. In fact, that's the main reason I was taught growing up, that they were in the wrong. But I'm not sure that's all there is to it. I think that's part of the puzzle, probably. But just stop and think about it for just a moment. If you have a group of people living in one city, and they are starting to repopulate the earth, you think they're going to be able to stay in one city for very long? I mean, these are people we're talking about. There's going to be fights. There's going to be divisions, even if they all speak the same language. I don't know that they're forever going to stay in one place on the earth. Maybe. But let's think about that wording again. Come, let us build ourselves a city, a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be dispersed over the face of the whole earth. Now, I emphasize pronouns for a reason. What is the focus of this group of people as they undertake this project? What's their goal? Who are they investing in? Whose will are they pursuing? You see the problem? The problem is not so much what they're doing technically. The problem is not so much, even in a sense, what they're doing that will prevent them from doing other things, although again, I think that's part of it. The problem is their attitude, the focus. We're doing this so we can make a name for ourselves. In other words, we're trying to take our destiny in our own hands and do what we think will be best for us. It reminds me, ironically, of an expression that is voiced by the prophet Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 14. Isaiah in this text, possibly contrary to popular belief, I hope not, but In this text, he is discussing the king of Babylon and the attitude of the king of Babylon. Many centuries later, this is, of course, around the time that Babylon will take Israel into captivity. And Isaiah is essentially putting words in the mouth of the king of Babylon through inspiration, essentially expressing what the attitude of this king will be. And he says, "You said in your heart, I will ascend to heaven. Above the stars of God, I will set my throne on high. I will sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north." In other words, Isaiah is saying this king of Babylon is going to try and make himself great. That's his goal. He's exalting himself. He's saying, look at me, look at what I have done. In fact, if you remember from the book of Daniel that we've been studying, isn't that what Nebuchadnezzar specifically says, essentially? He says, look at all that I have built. And you remember what happens after that. God says, okay, you're a cow for the next 7 years. You get to walk around on all fours and eat grass and all that good stuff. The idea being, you have tried to exalt yourself, I'll show you just where that gets you. Because man's job is not to exalt themselves. It's to submit to God who can exalt. So what's the problem? I don't think the problem is just repopulation issues. I don't think the problem is just staying in one place. I don't think the problem is technology or building or anything like that. The problem is we are going to make a name for ourselves. Our focus is on us, what we can do. That's not something that has changed, is it? Mankind wanting to make a name for ourselves. That's still the same. But that's the problem. Essentially, we might say it like this. Noah's descendants at this point in time, they were trying to create a world in their own image. They weren't interested in God's provision. They certainly weren't interested in depending on God. None of this indicates dependence. It's all a self-made, we are going to do this and look at what we have done. They want to make a world in their own image. They want to say, look at us. They don't have any intention of considering what God has in mind for mankind. Which is ironic, considering that the last time mankind tried to go in a direction God didn't want, very, very recently in their history, he said, all right, we're wiping the slate clean. Obviously, they didn't learn the lesson. The people, isn't that ironic? The beings created in God's own image immediately resort to trying to create something in their own image instead of going back to the image that they were made in the first place. But let's ask another question. What could they really have done? Notice what God says. Here's what he's, I don't want to say afraid of in that sense, but here's his concern, maybe we should say. The Lord said, behold, they are one people. They have all one language, and this is only the beginning of what they will do. Nothing they propose to do will now be impossible for them. Again, that's interesting. What is God saying here? What could mankind really have accomplished? Why is this? It should be strange when we really ask the questions. Think about our own history. What would have been different if, let's say, we all spoke the same language? What could mankind really have done? And why would that be a problem? For us to consider, now we go to the very end of the Bible, all the way from Genesis to Revelation. Remember how the beast is described, the first beast, as we talked about extensively, representing the Roman Empire. The world is worshiping the dragon through the beast, essentially. It says they worship the dragon, for he'd given his authority to the beast, and they worship the beast, and notice, saying, who is like the beast, and who can fight against it? In other words, in this case, who is like the Roman Empire? Even today, by many measures, we could say there never was before and never has been since an empire quite like Rome. In terms of its influence, in terms of its length, in terms of its power. Obviously, they didn't have atom bombs and missiles, but in terms of the day and time they were in, I would argue you still don't really have an empire to match them in many ways in our history. But do you see the focus? Even the expression in Revelation 13, the way the world sees Rome at that time, who is like them? Who can fight against them? Well, who built Rome? Oh, man. Now, obviously, God allowed it. But the point is, look at what man has created. Look at the civilization that has been established. Look at how far we have come as the human race. That's the sentiment that's being expressed. I want us to think for just a moment about the legacy of the human race. Think about the amazing things we've built. When you think about civilization, when you think about what we have done, the name we have made for ourselves on the earth, there's a lot of things we can think about, aren't there? There are things that we sometimes call the wonders of the world. They're incredible. Incredible feats of architecture and artistry. There are all sorts of advances we have made in things like technology. There's all sorts of advances that we have made in medicine. There's all these things that we have done. And it's very common in our world, and has been common forever, for us to look back at those things or look at the things currently and say, wow, look at what we have accomplished. I would argue that's the same attitude they had. And yet, those aren't the only things we've accomplished, are they? For every great work of art and architecture, every advancement in technology and medicine for the good of mankind, there's been plenty of evil that has also been left as a legacy of our race. The human race has been responsible, yes, for much good, but also for so much evil. Think about what we could have done if there weren't obstacles in our way. Think about if the human race were more united. Let me ask you a question. If we as a human race were more united, we weren't separated by things like language and culture, would there still be sin among us? Oh, yes. Now, I want us to think for just a moment. How much could we have accomplished in terms of how much sin would have accomplished through us if there were fewer obstacles in the way of our advancement? I shudder to think. Oftentimes, you read books that are set in the future, science fiction, things like that. We're pursuing more unity as mankind in those kind of futuristic settings a lot of times. Not all of them, obviously, but a lot of times, for example, I think about maybe Star Trek, right? The entire planet Earth is now kind of unified under one kind of banner, if you will. And we think of that as kind of the ideal. That's what we're striving for. That's what we're moving towards. And then we think about how evil mankind has proven themselves to be over the centuries. Maybe unity wouldn't be a good thing to that degree. Maybe there was some wisdom in the separation. But even beyond that, going back for just a moment, imagine all the good that could legitimately be accomplished if we were more unified. Yes, there would be more good, I think, that would be accomplished, as well as the bad. I'm not saying that the good would outweigh the bad by any means. But maybe there would be more good. Maybe there would be more great things that historically we could have done as a human race. wouldn't that have just made us less likely to be dependent on God? Wouldn't that have made us less likely to feel like we need something outside of ourselves? And more likely to say, oh, we can do anything that we set our minds to. That's why, I would argue, God did what he did. That's what we could have done. Our history isn't pretty. As much as we like to think the opposite, it's not. Our history as the human race is not pretty. Imagine if we had faced fewer obstacles and had fewer reminders of our frailty and of our dependence on God. Now, maybe we can see the other side of the picture. Maybe it was wise on God's part to divide us. Maybe it was wise on God's part. And people might say, but those divisions have caused so many more problems. Well, perhaps they've caused different problems. I don't think they've caused more. Sin is sin, and it will reveal itself no matter what. Perhaps by creating divisions, God has kept the sin from spreading as much as it would have otherwise, in addition to keeping us from being as limited, or as unlimited rather, in what we perceive as our own abilities. Now, please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that because of those divisions there are groups that are better than others or anything like that. That's where a lot of people have taken it in our history, another very ugly aspect of human history. I'm saying the fact of division itself is what God had in mind, clearly. So let's talk about the nature of the division as we wrap up. Why confuse languages specifically? God sees a problem here. He sees a problem with the attitude of mankind. He sees a problem with what the future will hold if mankind continues in this direction. So he confuses the languages. Why that? How does that help? How does confusing the languages of mankind help? He says, let's go down there, confuse their language, and here's the reasoning, so they may not understand one another's speech. So he dispersed them from there over the face of all the earth, left off building the city. There's a couple of things we might think of just off the bat. Number one, the irony. The irony that mankind, as this is happening, says, oh, we can do anything we want to. And then one of the most simple, basic things that allows for human beings to interact with one another is just changed like that. It's kind of ironic, kind of meant to be a little funny maybe even. But what else? Well, one thing that I can't help thinking about. Jesus would say centuries later, what comes out of the mouth proceeds from the heart, and this defiles a person. Why does God confuse languages? Why is that his choice of action? Well, perhaps, maybe it's a little bit symbolic. After all, what's the problem? The problem is mankind is expressing a sense of arrogance, a sense of independence from the necessity of God, a sense of desire to focus on self and make everything around in the image of self. Well, that's an expression of where the heart is. The problem is not just what's said, but what it indicates about what is thought. Perhaps that's part of it. But something else is also interesting. It's better to take refuge in the Lord than to trust in man, the psalmist says. How many times has a human being fooled people into giving him power or her? How many times has that happened in human history? Someone through flattery, through whatever, bravado, has convinced people to support them and put them in a place of power. Has that happened a lot, you think? It's happened constantly. How much easier would it be for one individual to deceive people into putting their trust in them rather than God if we all spoke the same language? I mean, think about it. Think about people who have rose to power and prominence in various cultures throughout history. How much did they really gain influence over the people outside of their culture and language and so forth? There was some of that, certainly, some more than others, depending on the situation. But typically, that kind of gets contained a little more. For example, if there arises a very, very popular leader in Europe, Americans are not going to be as prone to be like, oh yeah, we're going to follow him. We have our own culture, our own language, our own set of practices and customs. Imagine if none of those barriers were there. Imagine how much easier it would be for people to be deceived into putting their trust in a person. All hypotheticals, I understand. But maybe if we follow some of these hypotheticals, we can begin to see the wisdom of God in confusing the languages. But as we conclude, I want us to notice something. God confuses the languages, divides mankind, makes sure they won't be able to do as much as they think, and God acknowledges in many ways they can do when they are united. He divides them by their languages. For a long time, you see mankind divided by these languages, and only one group with one specific language is given a covenant directly with God. And that's not to say that others couldn't follow God. There was another system for that in a different way. But only one group of people, the Jews, united by culture and language and so forth, were given this direct covenant in this way with God. But remember what happens in Acts chapter 2? You have people assembled in Jerusalem to celebrate a feast. These people are from all corners of the globe, or of the world at that point. They didn't know it was a globe even yet. But they're from all corners of the Mediterranean world. They're gathered, and they don't speak the language. Now, maybe a lot of them spoke Greek, which was a common language throughout the Roman Empire at that time. But their native language was not the same as all these other people around them. And yet you remember what God does as the gospel begins to be presented? Instead of dividing people by confusing the languages, he allows people to begin to speak in each other's languages. The apostles stand before the crowd, speaking each to one another in their own language, so that everyone present can hear the gospel message in their language. Now I want you to think all the way back to Genesis. Why were they divided by their languages? Well, because their hearts, their focus, the message that they were hearing, that they were putting their focus on, that they were giving their allegiance to, was against God. And God needed to divide them from that. God needed to thwart that design, because that design ultimately was from the enemy and not from him. But when the time finally came for the Messiah to come, for the final solution to be put in place, it's the reverse. Instead of dividing by language, that division is overcome. And it's overcome not for the glory of man. It's overcome so that people can once again realize their need to depend on God because of what God has done for us. That's beautiful. That's poetic. Never let anyone tell you that God is not a God who loves poetic beauty. Not just in words like the book of Psalms, but in life. God disrupted mankind's ability to communicate. It's still disrupted in a sense. But when a message came, that could solve our problem, the problem that made it necessary for mankind's ability to communicate to be disrupted in the first place. When that message came, God began to reverse the process. Now, are there still divisions because of language and culture and things like that? Sure. But you know, a message that has gone out throughout the world, throughout language and culture at this point, it's the only message that can truly unite mankind. It's the only message that can put us back into a state one day where we won't have divisions based on things like culture and language, because we won't even be in this state, in this life. We will be united in a far better place where there are no divisions. All because of a message that God allowed to unify instead of divide. Babel reminds us that our goal in life is not to leave behind a legacy of man's greatness. That was their goal. We're going to make a name for ourselves. That was their stated goal. That's not our goal in this life. There are many things that we as human beings, and I'm talking about the human race, many things we've accomplished. If that's where we put our focus, if that's what we want to contribute to in our lives, we've missed the point. Our goal is not to leave behind a legacy of man's greatness, but to pursue God's. Anything else is pointless. Everything that man has built, everything that man has accomplished, it'll all be forgotten one day. It'll all be destroyed one day. Our goal in life is to pursue God and His greatness. And we need reminders, especially in today's world where we still are glorifying the advancements of civilization. We need to remember that while those may be useful in their place, if those become our goal, we've lost our way. We need that reminder more than ever. If there is anything that we can do to assist you this morning, to pray for you, perhaps you have lost sight of your goal and you want to correct your course and focus on God and not on yourself, not on mankind, not on the things of this world. If we can pray for you, if we can study with you, if we can help you understand what the gospel means and how to obey the gospel and become a Christian, whatever your need might be, please let us help you as we stand and sing together.
Have you been to Jesus for the cleansing power? Are you washed in the blood?